Agnès Poirier, thank you so much for joining us today from your own lockdown in Brittany, I believe. Now, your book, Notre-Dame, The Soul of France, has just been published, and it's an exploration of the history and significance of that world-famous cathedral. Now, this comes a year after the building went up in flames before our eyes here in Paris. And in fact, you had a front row seat from your home. What was your first thought, the most significant feeling you had while watching the fire?
Well, I had just arrived the day before from London, and I was in Paris to actually cover if you remember, the presidential address that President Macron was supposed to be delivering that night. And so I was just hard, working on that when from the corner of my eye and through the window of my kitchen, I saw some huge, very intriguingly yellow clouds. And it was so huge that it could only come from the river. And beyond the river stood Notre-Dame. So I thought, this is not possible. I rushed down the stairs. And I was on the Quai de la Tournelle then, with a lot of people already massing on the river banks, and it was the most, the strangest, the most beautiful and upsetting sight that I thought I never thought I would see.
Your book delves into the backstory of the cathedral from its 12th century origins, going through key moments in its history. And one episode I found particularly interesting was its reconciliatory role between the church and the state, or as you put it, the synthesis between civilian and religious power during the revolutionary period, the post-revolutionary period, when every other symbol of Catholicism had come under fire. Notre-Dame remained, but it was given a new name.
Yes, it was overnight. It became not Our Lady anymore, but the Temple of Reason. And then, of course, a year later, under Robespierre, it became the Temple of the Supreme Being. And during the French Revolution, it became this sort of laboratory of ideas. Revolutionaries would just flock there to celebrate the abolition of privileges, the storm of the Bastille, because, in their view, God or the Almighty of Providence could only be on the side of the revolution. But in the end, they bound religion altogether, and it became the Temple of Reason, the only deity, worth worshipping. And it also became a warehouse for wine, the wine that had been confiscated from the aristocrats. But it was very interesting to study the late 1780s, because you understand so much that, it's the cathedral of the people.
And beyond religion, the cathedral is well known in the cultural landscape as well, through paintings, literature, especially Victor Hugo's Hunchback of Notre-Dame. Now, that novel, published in 1831, wasn't just a literary success. There was a political subtext there from Victor Hugo, if I'm not mistaken. He had an agenda and a role to play in the building's fate. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, yes. 5 years earlier, when he was only aged 23, he wrote a pamphlet that was very successful called War onto the Demolishers. What he wanted the French to realize that their medieval past in historic monuments were, fading away, were crumbling down. And he said something quite profound that became, if you like, the new law that would be passed by Louis Philippe. That is to say, there are two things in a building. There's its use and its beauty. The use belongs to the owner, but its beauty belongs to everyone, to you, to me, to all of us. And therefore, it is exceeding one's rights to destroy a building of such significance. And that's really at the core of the Department of Historic Buildings, Historic Monuments, that was created in France in 1834. So you could say that Victor Hugo, not only with his novel, The Hunchback of Notre-Dame, but also with his passion, because he was also a politician, changed completely the face of cultural heritage and how you preserve monuments in France.
Now, when Notre-Dame went up in flames last year, there was an outpouring of grief, not only in France, but from around the world. And then there were waves of generosity as well, people making donations, just ordinary people. Why do you think people were so moved outside of France?
I was often asked that question from Washington, Sydney, Rome, and London. And they all told me, Agnès, explain to us why we feel so distraught. Some of us have been to Paris, seen Notre-Dame, been moved by it, but some of us haven't been there. And it's still extremely touching, moving, and what we feel is quite profound. What is it about Notre Dame? And I think that somehow we instinctively realize that I'll say she, Our Lady has been with us for 9 centuries. She's on par with the Great Wall of China and the pyramids in Egypt, for instance. She personifies the feat of architecture, and so she belongs to humanity as this gem that men were able to build.
Some of the larger sums of money pledged to the reconstruction of the cathedral came from France's wealthiest families and businesses, the Pinault, the Arnault, the Bettencourt. They pledged hundreds of millions of euros into the fund to rebuild it. Now, this came under fire from some who said that sort of money could be going to the many people in need in this country, not to a building. This is a difficult issue to navigate morally and socially. How do you gauge the public feeling about the allocation of this money?
Well, I think, a majority of the people were quite grateful to those very generous donators because they realized that, you can be a billionaire or just an ordinary citizen and be extremely moved by the fire. That's what happened with the first to pledge 100 million euros, François Pinault, who was in front of his television like the rest of us. France being France, of course, you will always have part of the population that will say, well, this is an all crumbling building, people in need, etc. And the church was actually pretty quick at reacting and saying, well, we have so much money now, we'll be able to actually give it to people. We need it for Notre-Dame, but there will be some left and we'll make sure it goes to the people in need.
And looking ahead to its reconstruction, specifically the design of it, there is something of an aesthetic battle now between those who believe that it needs a 21st century touch and those who wish to preserve the original aspect of the building. The building's original architects were actually anonymous, but do you think that that's possible in a time of starchitects, as we call them, and statement buildings, signature renovations?
So I don't know if you remember this flurry of projects, some of them completely fantastical and extravagant, a swimming pool, a diamond-shaped spire, also torch instead of the fire, beam of light, and also a wild forest with wild animals. A year later, I think it was because we were in shock. It was our way to get it off our chest. But it looks as if I would be surprised if there's a sort of signature spire from a very well-known star architect. All the people I interviewed, art historians, architects, all prefer that the spire is rebuilt the way it was, simply because Viollet-le-Duc, who redesigned that spire in the 1860s, was not only an erudite, but he really knew his stuff and was extremely faithful to the spirit of medieval builders.
Now, as a writer, a lot of your work is in its nature solitary, but launching a book, promoting it is more of a real-life business. How have you been navigating that, given the current circumstances?
That book was supposed to come out in 3 countries the same week. And in France, it was decided that it would be postponed to next year, to the 15th of April, 2021, and the second anniversary of the fire. So People can still, in the UK or in Holland, where it came out, they can still order online and being delivered by independent bookshops. They can also download it. We're all in this together, so we have to adapt.
So now that we all have a little more free time for reading, apart from your book, which I personally would recommend, what would you recommend for us? Do you have any literary advice, books that would be particularly good to dip into right now?
Well, there is this book, or rather this series of book by a great French writer, and I have a whole collection of them, collected throughout the years in flea markets in France. And I thought I was always going to keep it for, an occasion. And I think the lockdown is the occasion. So this is what I'm reading at the moment. And, À la recherche du temps perdu by Marcel Proust, remembrance of things past. And it's about longing, it's about the past, it's about how you've lost the past. It's perfectly fitting for the time we're living. And it's, of course, extraordinary. And I think, reading it in my 40s is so much better than reading it in my 20s. So, and also there are so many books that the lockdown can go on for a year. I'd be very happy.
Your library's well stocked, I believe. Agnès Poirier, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.